There was something so indescribably unnatural about seeing her move that I wanted to tear apart the image and erase it from my mind. Lily's corpse was a nightmarish thing, something that shouldn't have been. Reaching my brother as he fell to his knees, she slowly placed a hand on his shoulder before tilting his head back. He obeyed everything with his eyes closed in a sort of sleepwalk. I wasn't even sure if he was conscious, but he certainly didn't react as her mouth erupted open, revealing a mangled mess of what looked like countless hypodermic needles, dripping with saliva. She slowly leaned towards his neck and bit down, sinking each needle into his flesh as sticky saliva flowed in globs and dripped to the ground. That's when I shouted. I wish I hadn't, though. She reared back in shock and by doing so tore a chunk of flesh from his neck. Her eyes went wide as he broke from his trance and collapsed to the ground, clawing at his neck hysterically as blood pumped out in jets. I ran to him and tried in vain to do anything to help, but the blood squirted out in between my fingers as I tried to cover his wound. Within seconds, his eyes went dead and he stopped squirming. Whirling around, I caught Lily's wrist just as she turned to run. She shielded her face from me and threw up her hands to protect herself. I drew a breath. Her hands were shredded and bloody, dirt caked in between her splintered and torn off fingernails. From digging her way up, I thought to myself. Laura, she started. Shut the hell up, I screamed. Don't you dare call me that with that voice. I broke out in tears, my voice quavering. Don't you dare. She slowly turned around, her luminescent eyes fixed sheepishly on the ground. I'm sorry, she whispered through that horrendous mouth. Shut up, I screamed, throwing her to the ground forcefully. You're not allowed to be here. You can't be here. I was bawling, the salty tears obscuring my vision. This is wrong. You are wrong. She winced at that, looking at her hands for a long while. Isn't it better me than someone else? She finally said, her eyes glancing at me, radiating a pale yellow in the darkness. I didn't understand. Wouldn't you rather, she continued, wouldn't you rather I did it to you? My blood froze. I'm your family, your sister. If not me, then someone else will get you all the same. What do you think made me like this? She started to stand, her spindly limbs bending unnaturally. You're not my sister, I stammered. You're not her, not anymore. But I am, she cooed, a kind of wildness taking over her eyes. Blood continued to drip from her mouth, soaking the ground by her feet. My heart rate quickened and she seemed to notice, a smile erupting on her face. All that's different, she started, her voice strained. Is this hunger? You couldn't possibly understand. My insides burn. I can barely take it. She took a step forwards as I took a step back. It's okay, she whispered. It's me. Relax. Frantically searching for something to defend myself, I found a small salt shaker that had been left in my pocket since dinner that night. There was barely anything inside, but when I pulled it out, her eyes narrowed. Fumbling with the cap, I quickly undid it and spilled the salt onto the ground before she could react. No! She cried in horror as it scattered across the dirt, her face contorting in rage. She hissed venomously as she collapsed to her knees in agony. I had only heard it in folklore, and I was surprised that it had worked, but I quickly regained my composure. Stay away from me, I stammered, backing up. Her teeth clenched in rage. She slowly began counting. 1, 2, 3. She spit out each number as if it were poison as she picked up each grain of salt and placed it by her side. She would need to count every last one before she could move on. I turned around and began to slowly head back to camp. Wait, she stammered behind me, a hint of uncertainty building in her voice. I didn't turn around and just kept walking. She stammered a few more times before suddenly crying out in panic. Wait, she screamed. Laura, wait! I whirled around in a fury. I said not to call me that, I screamed, fists clenched. Laura, she continued, voice shaking uncontrollably. Please forgive me, I'm sorry. She glanced in horror over at the horizon. I could see the sky beginning to grow lighter. It would be sunrise soon. I coldly ignored her and slowly turned around. Better start counting, I said over my shoulder as I started walking. I could only imagine her face erupting in fear as she squealed. "Laura, Laura," she cried, clutching her face with her hands. "Please!" She started to sob, clawing at her face as songbirds began to sing. The sky was turning a red hue. I turned around again. Her eyes, wet and puffy, looked up at me as her lip quivered. "Oh, please," she whispered, exasperated. Despair, the likes of which I had never before seen on someone's face, enveloped her and made her seem almost human. I scoffed and looked at her, eyes narrowing. "I'm pretty sure there's more than 3 grains, I hissed before turning and walking away. She slowly sunk to the floor in despair and lay on the ground, eyes fixed straight ahead as she shivered uncontrollably. I didn't turn around, didn't even stop as the sun slowly peeked over the horizon, and she began to scream. I kept walking as her inhuman, tortured cries rang out and she thrashed around in pure agony, her skin boiling. Suddenly, remembering something, however, I turned around and walked past her mutilated corpse, melting, flaking, and scabbed over, in a fetal position as skin continued to sizzle and warp. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead as I watched them slowly crust over as her final squeal died out. Picking up a large rock, I heaved it over my head and walked over to my brother. I wasn't sure how the transformation worked, but I couldn't be too sure. His eyes fluttered as I approached and he croaked out my name, his voice faint and labored. I wasn't sure if he had any last words for me, but I didn't care, and the rock split his head in 2 as it smashed down. Reaching camp again, I was careful not to wake my still sleeping mother as I rummaged through the wagon, quickly finding our cleaver. Kneeling next to my mother, I stroked her hair lightly and whispered, "Sorry, but I can't be sure you haven't been affected." Her eyes flicked open and then immediately widened in terror and confusion as I slashed the cleaver downwards. A few hacks later and I tossed her bloody, sticky head into the fire. I sighed and slumped to the ground, exhausted. I looked up at the sky and cringed, turning away and shielding my face. The sun hurt my eyes.